This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on topics that matter to you, like artificial intelligence. Learn more at pli.edu/AIPod.
Welcome to AI in Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. I'm William Tanenbaum, host of the podcast and head of AI and data practice at Moses & Singer in New York. In this series, we bring you the latest perspectives on AI and data through timely talks with thought leaders working at the intersection of AI, data, and the law. In this episode, my guest is Anthony Algmin, a leading data professional and author, and our topic is A Data Professional Explains the Role of Data in AI. All right. Well, Anthony, really thanks for coming on board and doing this, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you again. And Anthony and I have known each other for quite a while, and we'll get to some of the touch points that we've had in common. But let's start, Anthony, and get a little bit of your history on your career in data. And I will tell the audience that I know you pretty well, and I think you are a true Jedi master of data professionals. So
Bill,
I think what you have to say will be very instructive to kind of give what the career path has been and how things have changed in the industry over the last few years.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Bill, and it's an honor to be here. And my career isn't a cookie cutter career in data, and it's not necessarily something that I would be able to go and map out for someone else. And I don't know if I would recommend doing that for someone else, but it kind of has 3 acts to it. And the first act, I, coming out of college, knew I liked technology, but wanted to do stuff with a business relevance. And I quickly found my way to doing data systems and technology development and business intelligence and all of these things that are putting data to use in various capacities. And I had a technical tool belt. So I did a lot of coding and database modeling and warehousing and all that stuff that happens in the caves of a company somewhere, often in the basement, sometimes not even in the same office as all the important business people. But I really understood what it takes to build out technology. And that really helped me. And I focused a lot in the financial industry and the trading space in Chicago, and had an opportunity to get an MBA, which was great because I always saw myself first as a business person. So I got the MBA and shortly thereafter went into consulting because I'd been in the financial space for a long time and I wanted to broaden my industry understanding. And so consulting gave me an opportunity to do just that and apply this kind of thinking, technical skills coupled with business and strategy in a more broad-based environment. What I didn't expect is that when I went into consulting, I quickly learned that there's a whole world around data and data management and data governance that I didn't even know existed. I'd just been trying to do a lot of this stuff when I was creating technologies. And I come to find out, there's people whose entire careers are in things like data governance or data quality or master data management and stuff like that. I'm like, this is a crazy world to me. And so I learned a lot about it. And so for the next decade or so, I did a lot of consulting, did a lot of work on strategy and data systems and how does data really connect into the success of an organization. Had an opportunity to be a chief data officer and then was doing my own consulting business when the pandemic hit, and I had an opportunity to go back to the industry side. So leave consulting, go back to a company and work in a pharmaceutical organization, helping an R&D business unit change how they work with data and technology and each other to drive improvements in finding medicine. And in the context of the pandemic, that seemed pretty important. And so I was able to come and do that. And that's been really eye-opening to get back onto that side after all of the different experiences that I've had in consulting and in finance and in technology, and realize just how challenging the day-to-day can be when there's so much going on and you're trying to make wholesale changes in a large organization tied to how you use data and how you ultimately drive better business through the insights and knowledge you gain from that use.
It's pretty interesting, and there's a little bit of a parallel to what I've done because I started off with a humanities background, and I ended up creating a major in the history of science and technology. And along the way, I focused on how does government organize technology, which led to the space program. And what I found was the most interesting thing about the space program is everyone talks about, Apollo 13 and how there was an explosion and they didn't land on the moon and they had to come back. What kind of took my interest was, well, let's think about this a second. That's really the biggest success of the Apollo program, was how to figure out how to deal with that problem with the limited resources that you had, cooperating with a bunch of guys in a can and a bunch of really smart engineers with duct tape and tubes and trying to figure out what to do. And so when I went into law, I kind of was attracted to the technical side of litigations, and I was comfortable with it, probably more so than a lot of people with a poli-sci major, for example. But the road to tech was pretty interesting from my perspective. And I started off as a tech and IP lawyer, and then data as a data asset, as a new asset class has taken my interest. So I think, we started from different positions. I don't have an MBA, but I can still write complete sentences. And I think that, it's been very interesting working with people with you. So before we do a little deeper dive here, I'm just kind of curious how you would characterize your interaction with lawyers as you've had all these different experiences.
I've had a lot of experiences with lawyers, and some have been positive, some have been less so. A lot of them have involved contracts. A lot of them have involved trying to get a deal done. And both sides on the business side often felt like, okay, we have to do this lawyer stuff to get the contract in a place where we can both sign it. But it was always about, okay, what do we have to do to make the lawyers happy enough to be able to get this done? But as time went on and as the deals got more complicated and bigger, the more I started to rely upon the lawyers that I worked with to make sure, A, that we were getting protections in the ways we needed to be protected, and B, that we had clarity in enough detail that both sides of the contract were able to arrive at success at the same time. And that became where I started to understand how lawyers think a little bit more and developed a true partnership with that. And then when I started doing more work in the data governance space especially, that's when you start to connect into organizational risk. And that's a whole different world. That wasn't contracts so much as it was making sure that we were good stewards of the things that we were building and of the data that we were using so that we didn't inadvertently put data at risk, put an organization at risk because of how we were managing data through it. And so we had to make sure that we had an understanding there. But oftentimes it led to negotiations with the lawyers because their first take is going to be, how can we protect this to the maximum ability? And my first take is, how can I use this the most possible and eliminate as much friction as possible? So we're kind of approaching it from two different sides of that coin. How can we find a place that is okay for both and allows us both to achieve our objectives to the greatest degree possible?
And how do you educate the lawyers to help you get there?
Well, I think it's first at arriving in a conversation that we can both understand, because I don't understand any of the lawyers' language and they don't understand most of my technology language, right? And so how can we get to a place where we understand what we're really talking about and what the trade-offs are? And so what we think about is how, like, if we're talking about something like a GDPR or something that is a compliance rule that's coming from regulation, we think about, what are we trying as a business to do with this data to drive something that's beneficial to the business? How are we trying to increase revenue, decrease costs, or do something in the business to manage risk, versus the legal aspects of understanding that regulation. A lot of times I don't know, and to be honest, sometimes I don't care what the regulation says. I just know what I'm trying to accomplish from a business strategy perspective, but I know and I'm aware and realize that I need to overlay the legal understanding of that risk management, because otherwise we're going to be doing something unintentionally that could cause us a lot of harm in the future. And that's something that I just have to approach it not thinking that I know everything. And the lawyers that I found the best working relationships with also are approaching it like, okay, I don't have all the answers myself, but together we can combine and get to the right collective answer for us both.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I think, as a lawyer myself, it's important to figure out, how do you get to yes, and what does success look like in a contract, and what does each side really need? And then if you prioritize that in consultation with your client, especially with the business people, then you can solve the 4 or 5 major issues. And some of the other issues are less important. I had an example where, the other side wanted to have like a 9-step escalation procedure for resolving disputes. And I just said, it's never going to happen. This is a critical deal. And if something goes wrong, the vice president of one side is going to call the vice president of another, and they're going to work out a business deal. And then the lawyers are going to make it, fit within the existing contract. So anyhow, I enjoy working with people who can tell me what they're really trying to solve, instead of saying, here's the deal, make it happen. I think there has to be some interaction. So, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just thinking too, I think sometimes about the adversarial versus community building aspects of the lawyer relationship from a business leader's perspective as I think about it, because sometimes I work very carefully with the lawyer on my side of the fence to present a strategy to the counterpart because we are trying to achieve something that they're reluctant to give us. And that can be a very useful tactic as well. It doesn't go so well if I have an adversarial relationship with my own lawyer, because if we're not on the same team, we can't act collectively in the best interests of our organization. And that's where I think we have to remember, okay, where are the teams really drawn first? We first have to protect our organization. We have to make sure that our organization gets the right benefits of this contract. We also want to grow the pie in conjunction with whatever business we're trying to do. But that neither of those things will happen if I have an adversarial relationship with the lawyer on my side of the fence because we don't see eye to eye or we can't get to that agreement on our side before we take it to a counterpart in the contract or in the business dealing.
Yeah, I think that's a very important perspective. And I think it's important for the lawyers to be totally acronym enabled so that they understand, why there's an acronym and what it really means. And, you can communicate with your people. I will say, incidentally, that my favorite acronym is TLA. You familiar with that, Anthony?
I don't know that I know that one.
Okay, this is a great thing. TLA stands for 3-letter acronym. So there's just some poetic justice in TLA. But I'd like to kind of switch gears now. This is something you and I have talked about, which is data as a change agent, a quote-unquote change agent. And, I've seen a lot of that in my practice, and I know that, in corporate life, as opposed to consulting life, you're really responsible for these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So let me just stop and ask you, what does change agent mean to you?
Oh, that's a great question. I wasn't expecting that question. I was expecting data stuff or but from a change agent.
All right. Well,
let's go with it. No,
No. Ask yourself a question.
Oh no, I want to answer this question. Change agent to me is something that can track its activities to a measurable differential in a business outcome. Because to me, change is imaginary if it's not driving business results. I think we often in our organizations get bogged down with activities, thinking that because we're working hard and we're doing something, that we're creating horsepower and not heat. I think about engines a lot. You and I are both car guys, right? And so I think about engines, and your engine, when you put gasoline into an engine and it explodes and stuff happens, engines at their best are 35% efficient, right? And so a lot is going to go to heat in a combustion engine, no matter what. But
so if you're saying lawyers are 35% efficient, we have to have a stop right here.
Okay. What I'm saying is that your engine creates some amount of heat and some amount of horsepower in any circumstance. The heat is wasted. It's generally just lost. When we work with data, it's the same deal. If I create a report and somebody looks at that report every day, and then that person does exactly what they would have done if they hadn't gotten the report, that report, by definition, has no value. It is not impacting anything. It's costing us something to produce it, but it's not driving any kind of change. So to me, to be a change agent, it needs to have a path to real business outcomes, to something that changes how the business performs, not just something that the business does because it wants to do something. It has to propel that business in a meaningful direction. And so to me, when it comes to data, the data connection to all of this is that data that sits idle and is never used has no value. Data that's used that doesn't change any behaviors, that doesn't impact a business, has no value. It is no realized value. There's potential value, but that potential only becomes realized when you change a behavior, when you change an activity in such a way that it can draw a line to a business outcome. And that, to me, is what change agents are all about. That's what it really has to be, is that this is something that can move the needle, even small movement of the needle on a business outcome. But that's where change actually exists. I think we get too bogged down in this idea of activities, but the activities don't have direct value. It's the deliverables. It's the outcomes. That's what we really need to manage to. And that's really what change should be oriented towards.
Yeah, I agree. In my mind, there's a paradigm. The data turns into information. Information turns into insights. Insights turn into actionable insights, and they get into a business activity. That turns into something that's measurable, and then the loop starts again. I think allied to this is something I want to speak with you about, which is you really can't do data as a change agent without involving the IT organization, which, as most people know, data professionals are often not part of IT and vice versa. So, and the other thing is these projects, from a company point of view, they're spending a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of people effort, and subject then to executive scrutiny because of all that expenditures in all those three categories. So I look at this and figure out, okay, how do I, for my own client, make sure that the IT and the data people are aligned and effectively making me understand what the contract has to do? And especially if there's some third-party vendor, either on the data side or on the IT side. So let's circle back and put a little edge on this and get your observations on combining data and IT for the change purpose.
Yeah. So there's a couple thoughts that I have on this particular topic. And I feel sometimes that I'm the lone person carrying this particular flag in the data management and data community, but I really don't like how a lot of the data professionals have moved further and further away from the IT organization, because quite frankly, you can't do data at all without some sort of technology involvement, like you said, right? And so to me, further separation there isn't really the answer. I think the answer is that our technology organizations have lost their connection to those kinds of outcomes and those kinds of change that I was just talking about. And I think the real answer is to kind of rethink how our technology organizations connect into the rest of the business. And that's something that I think is a much harder problem to solve, but I think it has much greater returns in the end, is realizing that data and technology are super close together and they need to work in tandem to drive business impacts by virtue of the people that are using those technologies and the data and those insights. Machines don't truly have insights. They can fake it pretty well, especially with all the AI stuff that's going on. But ultimately, at least for now, people are the ones that ultimately make decisions around business processes and are implementing that technology to drive business outcomes in some way or another. Sometimes it's just supervisory, but they're involved in that loop at some point. I think that our technology needs to be delivered in such a way that it is as relevant as possible to driving the maximum change of those business outcomes through those people that are working with it. And I think the reason that the technology organizations have often lost their way is that it's relatively tangible. Technology is great, right? You can see it, you can interact with it, you log into it every day. But even though it's tangible, it's again that kind of slippery slope between a proxy of, oh, we're doing things and it's work, but is it really adding value to the organization through an outcome that matters to the business? Or is it just one more thing that you're putting energy in towards that is creating more heat than it is horsepower?
So is there a different definition of value for IT than for data people?
I don't think so. I think it's exactly the same. I think, and actually, I think it's for the same for the business as well. If you're orienting your actions, whether it's data or technology or business process or marketing or lawyering, whatever it is, if you can't track that to some business outcome through some myriad of links and connections and all that, get it. Like, it's hard to do, but you have to at least be able to conceive, how does this make our business better in the end? If you're not doing that in whatever role you have, you're not adding value and there's no value to that. That's where I think too many folks and this is something that I've seen through all the work that I've been doing throughout these many years, is I've seen plenty of people that have gone through their entire careers and not had any real thought about how they've impacted the businesses in the end. Like they've just done their function and they've never questioned, okay, what have I really changed? What have my efforts contributed towards that led to real business outcomes? And it's not that they haven't contributed to business outcomes. They probably wouldn't have had jobs that long under most circumstances if they weren't contributing to business outcomes, but they hadn't really made that connection. And to me, that's really sad because that's where the value of your career turns into value for a business, which made it all worthwhile. And that, I think, is something that we should all be thinking about regardless of where our function lies. And constantly be thinking about, how do I make a bigger impact? If I can make a bigger impact, I'm adding more value, and then I'm more valuable because of it.
I think that's a really key point. And what I've seen sometimes is there is a difference in how people define value. And there is, and it floats down to a contract. I mean, I had a contract where, there was an excessive focus on service levels and what the penalties for missing a service level were going to be. And I think to sit there and fight about whether you're going to have $1,000 or $100 for every X minutes of outage up to, a certain cap, regardless of how many failures you have. And then there's the ability to recapture your penalties by good behavior. And then you have a fight about what's the measurement period, right? Because if it's too short, then you can keep failing. And if it's too long, then you can fail, but it gets averaged out into not being a failure. But I've had a situation where we're doing this, and I stepped back and thought, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And it wasn't just uptime. It was getting the special services of the vendor. And there was time constraints on the special services. So the point was not to get into a nickel and diming over service levels, but how do we drive an incentive to give the client, in my case, my client, access to the specialized people, the SWAT team, if you will. So the thing was up, and services were provided to the client's customers. Client doesn't care if he gets service credits. Mm-hmm. The client just needs, not the client, the customer just needs to get what they're paying for.
Yeah.
And it doesn't do them any good to know they didn't get it, but someplace along the line, someone paid something for it.
Yeah. It also, I think that's a really strong point about what really matters, right? And I also think back to a time when I was trying to get something done that nobody wanted to do at a vendor. So this dates back to when I was at Chicago Transit Authority as their chief data officer. Might have actually been when I was consulting there beforehand. But regardless, we were struggling to be able to run basic analytics on our fare system. Like how many people rode the bus and how many people rode the train, like each day. Like we're not talking about something that is really complicated here. We're talking about just basic analytics, right? And that was something that needed access to a level of data that hadn't previously been provided. And this will happen in many of your clients, right? Where they had bought a reporting tool, and the vendor, which we had a fare system vendor that compiles all this data about people who ride the bus and trains, they're the ones collecting the money for us, right? They'll provide an interface. They'll provide a dashboard for us to go and do stuff. Well, the dashboard didn't work very well, and it didn't really give us the level of detail that we wanted to have. And so we're like, okay, we want to be able to run our own reports and that stuff, give us all the data. And they're like, we're not giving you all the data. That's too much. There's too much data to be given to you in this. So I had to go and look at the contract for the fare system. And thank goodness some lawyer who I never met, who clearly had no idea that we were going to end up needing to do this one day, but just knew it would be a good idea, is that they put a clause into the contract that said the Chicago Transit Authority has every right to use any of this data and can at any point request all of it to be delivered. It was like so black and white. It was the most beautiful sentence I had ever read because I just took that piece of the contract, sent it to my counterpart over at the vendor, and I'm like, we need all the data. And they're like, oh no. And so then they got it to us. It took a while, but it was just, we didn't even have to get lawyers involved. We just had to know what the contract said, and somebody had done a really good job on the authority side to be able to set up that deal in such a way that we were then able to get that data, start doing the analytics, and it made a huge difference in what the organization was able to do with data going forward.
And where did metadata play a role in this?
Oh, metadata is this thing that I like sheepishly have to admit, like I love metadata. I think it's the greatest thing in the world because I realized at one point, metadata is a complicated word to mean something very simple. Metadata is context of the data that you're talking about. It is the data. They call it the data about data, but I don't think brains work in a way that makes sense. It's really just context. So if you're talking about, hey, we need to understand where this information was sourced from because we need to know what system it was about, or we need to try to figure out if it's got a sufficient level of quality to drive the kind of thing that we want to do with it, and if it can be used for different events. It's the context around it that helps you navigate all of that. And so when you think about metadata in a contract, could be things like who was the lawyer on the counterpart side, or who was the business executive that was working with our legal team to do it. It may not be written out in plain English in the words in the contract itself, but having that kind of contextual information can prove very useful down the road when you're like, I want to understand what happened here. And so that's where I think when it comes to metadata, it's really something that is a subcomponent of understanding data quality. And data quality is a misunderstood topic. It's kind of the reverse problem. Metadata is a complex term to mean something simple, context of data. Data quality is a simple term that's actually more complicated than it appears. Data quality, most would reasonably deduce, is the data good? In reality, data quality, is the data good enough for what I want to do with it? Which is a much different question, because anytime you want to use data, it may or may not be able to support what it is that you want to do with it. The data is not inherently good or bad. It just has different properties. It has different contexts. It has different capabilities to drive some other use. And so, and this is true of any kind of thing that has different levels of granularity or different levels of precision, is you can do different things with different levels of precision. So some data could be useful for one thing. It could be useful for a marketing campaign, but it may not be useful for balancing your books. It's that kind of thing that we have to understand the nuance behind. And metadata really helps us navigate that, because you can't tell what the quality of data is really unless you understand or hypothesize or have a intended use, because it's always a reflection of, can I use it for a thing? Or what kinds of things could this data be useful for? And that's where simple term, much more complicated in actually putting it to use. And then you try to think about, well, okay, how do we do data quality and actually provide all of this context of the data and let people use it for different things and understand what they should or shouldn't use any data for, when we're struggling to even just be able to provide the data in the first place in a way that isn't all messed up. So there's a lot that we're asking of data now that without a better competency around data quality, we're going to run into a bunch of different challenges. And this actually ties into the thing that I'm really scared about these days, which is AI. I'm not scared about AI taking over the world. I'm scared about us relying on AI to do more and more of our job and having it get it woefully wrong, because we don't know better ourselves, because the data that the AI is looking at is the same data we're looking at, and yet we don't have any understanding of whether or not that data can really be used for the things we intend. And when technology is amazing as it connects to data, because it is an amplifier of whatever it touches, right? AI is like the most amazing amplifier in the world, because you don't even have to write the code behind it. It writes itself. But that kind of amplifier, if you're amplifying a impure or degraded source or low data quality source, you're going to have a really noisy, really unreliable, really unpleasant existence with AI. And that's the kind of thing that I don't know is obvious, that I think is really important for people to get their heads around, because I think you probably in the legal space, I imagine, have a ton going on right now with the implications of AI. My concern is that we're missing the boat. Like, I had a colleague that gave me a biography that was written about him. He was prominent enough that ChatGPT could write a biography about him. And read the biography, and we're like, yeah, that sounds great. That is an amazing biography. It did it in like 1 second. It was amazing. And he's like, yeah, it was amazing. Half of it's wrong. I'm like, no way. And so he sent me another version that has half of it in red. He's like, everything in red here is either a misstatement or completely false. And it was literally half red. And I'm like, ChatGPT, though, just gave it to me like it was 100%, like it was 100% quality. And if you think about what I just talked about in terms of data quality, all it did was say, well, I used data. I'm going to assume it's perfectly accurate. And everything I deduce about this imperfect data in reality is also perfectly analyzed. So now I'm going to give you this thing and assert, by giving it to you in this kind of language, in human language, I'm going to assert that it's accurate. And it is absolutely not. But because it's presented in such a way that our normal cues as people would have us believe it's accurate and have us believe that it's trustworthy, and the machine said it is, so it must be. We are going to rely on AI already. We're seeing things that people are looking at this stuff and they're like, well, this is what it is. No, it's not. It was trained on bad data. It didn't have the inputs that it needed, and it amplified a whole bunch of wrong. So just got to be very careful about this as we go forward, because this is just the beginning. We're getting more and more powerful on the AI side, and yet we're still woefully incompetent on our data capabilities at the foundational level. It's like, let's build a 200-story building on top of a sandcastle and see how it goes. That's kind of where we are right now.
Yeah, I guess it depends who provides the sand. But I think this is a whole other topic. The thing, you can go on forever on this stuff. I mean, if you're just taking uncurated data and say, go tell us when the War of 1812 was and somebody got it wrong, that's going to pop up. The thing I saw in some of the healthcare stuff that I do, doctors are very concerned that they know what the AI model, what weight it gave to different factors. And that's the black box in healthcare. And we had a very funny, similar situation, which just identifies the core value of how good your data is. The task was to try and teach the machine to be able to distinguish between a skin lesion and a malignancy in a tumor. And I'm telling you this because I know you're in pharma. And so they fed it a bunch of pictures, just like you think it would do, and hoped that it would find the patterns and be able to discern this without getting tired and looking for 1,000 images, in 4 days or whatever. But the thing that was interesting is usually when physicians suspected that it was a tumor, they would put a ruler there and measure it. So what did you tell the machine? You gave them pictures, okay? And what did the machine do? It decided ruler or no ruler, So you didn't advance the ball, right? Because it just decided if there was a ruler there, it was a malignancy, because that was the indicator of a malignancy. So it's hard to get this right.
Oh, yeah.
And it's hard. In healthcare, sometimes we run parallel machines just to see if there's some correlation in the results.
The shorthand I've been thinking about a lot lately is this kind of old school notion of book smarts versus street smarts. And AI is the ultimate, the natural limit of book smarts, because that's all it's got. It doesn't have that experiential. It doesn't have that BS detector of, oh, wait, no, this isn't right. Oh, no, I'm not. I have to ignore the ruler in this because that has no bearing on what we're actually looking at in the image. But the AI doesn't know. It's just going with whatever it can find. And we may mean well in giving it all these images. We can train it with a billion images. But if it's ruler or no ruler, you're right. It's not gonna understand the nuance there. And it's in the nuance that experience matters. And that's where I think AI can be an extremely useful accelerator or amplifier, but you've got to get that source right in the beginning. And we have to still rely on our street smarts to implement it in responsible ways. And I think that we're going to see plenty of extreme examples of AI being overly relied upon, sometimes with bad source, sometimes with bad training, sometimes with bad intent. And we're going to see some pretty big explosions in terms of outcomes that are undesirable because of that reliance in a place that, if you really looked at the risk management side of what was being created, especially if you have a black box and you say, okay, all I can do is measure the inputs and measure the outputs, but I can never really see or interpret what's inside. That's an inherently risky activity. Every time it's going to be an inherently risky activity. So how do we plan around that? How do we protect around that? And how do we hold folks accountable for things they didn't directly do? And I think that there's going to be just such an evolution here that we have to be very thoughtful about, because I don't think we're going to be able to put this thing back in a box. We're not going to be able to say, hey, no AI, it's happening. But how do we help it do more good than the problems that can be created from doing things that we shouldn't?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of companies are using generative AI to just increase their search results, right? They're just turning out a lot of things that the search engines find. I will say the legal point is, we have rights clearances, right, in the copyright world. How do you know that you have the right to use something, and do you need to go get a license and permission? How do you possibly do rights clearances on generative AI, which is reading the entire internet or most of it? It's a problem that someone's going to have to solve. So since the lawyers can't do it, Anthony, I thought you'd figured out how to do it by now. And I'll just stop there. It's been really great talking with you, and I'd love to continue this. And I want to end with a question that I'm sure you're not expecting, and you can say no to this, but I'm really fascinated by first of all, I think big data is really big metadata. That's how I tend to think of big data. But going back to what we were discussing, data is a change agent, where it involves all kinds of people from all kinds of business units within a company. So here's my question. Having done a lot of these change agent, if you had to set them to music, what would be the soundtrack?
That is an unexpected question. If I were going to set it to music, what is it, the Benny Hill theme? That's the one that comes to mind immediately. that is the, but I don't know because we're certainly not a well orchestrated machine. Like, this isn't classical music. This isn't highly structured yet either. And I think that it is a bit more chaotic, and it's probably a bit more today like jazz or something, because there's some rules to it that seem to be followed, but there's a lot of going off book as well. And I think that it's far too hard to replicate exactly our intent the way you would in extremely structured musical environments, like an orchestra, where everybody has a very defined role and a very clear expectation based on the sheet music. Whereas jazz, like, you're just getting up on stage and you're going with it, man. You're feeling the flow and you're doing it. We're somewhere closer to jazz. I don't think it's as pleasant to listen to in where we currently are. And I think that even with the tools that we have and the ability to amplify it with technology that is truly amazing, and yet we haven't done a good enough job building our own skills and using that kind of power responsibly, I am concerned about it. And I completely agree with you around big data is really big metadata. Like, it's metadata. What I really should have said around metadata is that metadata is how people relate to the data. That's the context. That's the how do you relate as a person to the data that you are working with, and then you can amplify the data, but that story then is how a person can relate to it at scale, because you will never be able to go in and understand ones and zeros and data points or whatever. You're doing aggregations, you're doing calculations, you're doing all this to amplify it up in a way that you can then react to it and start driving change from it. And I think that all change that involves people is going to be messy. I think it's always going to have a lot of variant interests in it and different perspectives, and nobody's perspective even alone is pure. Everybody's running things through, what's best for me, what's best for my company, what's best for my job situation, what's best for this department, what's best for the kids that I would like to get home and see someday. Like, there's a lot of different things that people are running through, and you start to mash together, 10, 12, 20 different people together in a particular initiative. All of a sudden, things get hairy. And that's where we have to recognize that as precise as data theoretically is, with ones and zeros in some technology system somewhere, the reality is applying that data is a much less precise, much more nuanced, much messier, much more artisan type of connection. And it probably should be, because otherwise we're going to end up with things like AI that can identify rulers in cancer images, but can't identify the cancer in the cancer images. Things like that are going to be, hilarious anecdotes later, but as they happen are going to have real impacts to real people, real businesses, and real lives. And that's where we need to make sure we get on top of our game so that we can not have the doctor become overly reliant on the AI that can identify rulers. I mean, that's just terrifying.
Well, I think you've hit on a really great point in which to end this session, which is data has context and it has to have value, and it doesn't have value without the context. And, I'm not sure the data professional's word for this, but you have to have trustworthy data at some level. And then the AI has to have what people call ethical AI, right? You have to be aware of the value judgments that are built into it. But anyhow, Anthony, I really liked your answer to the music. I think that was great and unexpected and insightful. And I thank you a lot for taking the time to visit with us.
Awesome.
So thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate being on the show.
Thanks for listening to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast represent those of the host and individuals being interviewed, and not necessarily those of PLI. For more AI-related content from the Practicing Law Institute, visit pli.edu/AIPod.